book displayed, or the cover of which is displayed at the top right of the screen here, was published in 1927. Charles Homer Haskins, the author, was, by some accounts at least, the first American historian of the Middle Ages of real renown. And this book was truly a seminal work in the history, in the scholarship about medieval history. But note the title here. Okay, so up to that point, the term Renaissance had been applied really only to the 15th and 16th centuries, to the accomplishments of the Renaissance humanists, mostly of Italy, to inventor/artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And the emphasis on the Renaissance was mostly on the kind of rebirth of the culture of antiquity, right? An appreciation for everything that the ancients did well, things like law and science, and literary works and these sorts of things. And the work that pushed this to its greatest extent was called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, published in the 1860s. And that work really did find the origins of modernity. It was published by a Dutch scholar named Jacob Burckhardt, and it found the origins of modernity in the 15th and 16th centuries, and specifically in Italy. For Burckhardt and for others who thought like this, the rediscovery of antiquity and the pushing of that, further is what sped on modernity. And so Burckhardt goes through all of the features of the Renaissance of Italy. Well, in response to that, and you realize Haskins is writing about 50 or 60 years after Burckhardt, Haskins finds in the 12th century, and by this he doesn't mean literally, 1100 to 1199. He means, this thing that we call the long 12th century. We can, again, apply different dates to this, right? But the High Middle Ages, we might just say. He finds in that period all of the things that Burckhardt had identified as part and parcel of the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries. He finds it in the 12th century. An appreciation for the things of antiquity, the growth of science, the growth of the study and application of law, and a definite uptick in literary output, and an appreciation for the kind of stylization of literature in both Latin and the vernacular. And so Haskins kind of goes through chapter by chapter all of the great accomplishments of the 12th century. I personally think this title, Renaissance, is way overused. We've talked already in this class about how this gets applied to the Carolingian period as well. That's a kind of counter-revolution, we might say, of the early medievalists, a few decades after Haskins had published this. But that term Renaissance has, crept back into the Middle Ages. And since the term means rebirth, I think we eventually have to admit that nothing ever actually died, needed to be reborn. An appreciation for classical antiquity was something that remained in force all through the period that we call the Middle Ages. But nevertheless, this term, the Renaissance of the 12th century, has been used a lot by medievalists ever since then. And our our textbook even continues to use it, and there are books that continue to be published with this in their title. And so we need to deal with it, right? We need to deal with what this phenomenon is. To do this, I want to talk both about institutional aspects of the growth of intellectual activity in the High Middle Ages and the thinking that happened in those institutions. And this might run over 2 videos. I don't know that I can do this in a brief manner in only one, so we'll see how this goes. I want to start with monasteries. Monasteries are not identified as the key institutions where the 12th century Renaissance took place, but I think we have to appreciate, first of all, what monks and nuns were able to accomplish in the cloistered environment, and then also some of the limitations that were surpassed, or where by other institutions, or where other institutions moved in a different direction, but recognize that there is dialogue between monasteries and cathedral schools, eventually universities, and that monasteries were contributors to this whole thing. And it might be because my scholarship is primarily within monasteries, but I do think we need to have an appreciation for this. In the monastery, right, monasteries had libraries. They had scriptoria, where monks would sit day after day and make copies of books. I'll come back to the word authority in a second here. Copies of books, and where they would write their own works. Now, for understanding the intellectual environment of the Middle Ages, and especially that of the monastery, we have to grasp the importance of the word authority. This is the word auctoritas in Latin, and this is all over the writing of this period, and in fact earlier periods as well, okay? And I don't mean by this political authority, at least not primarily, okay? Authority in the intellectual environment would be an idea, or perhaps a text that contained the ideas, that was seen as irrefutable, and something that could not be challenged in any way, right? And so for people in the Middle Ages, the ultimate source of authority for ideas was probably the Bible. And by extension of that, the works of the ancient church fathers. Really, those things went together. One could not study the Bible without, in the Middle Ages at least, without also understanding the essential authoritative commentaries on the Bible by the works of the church, by the church fathers, figures like Augustine and Jerome, and Gregory, and so forth and so on, right? These had all commented on different books of the Bible. And so that's where authority is found. To understand God and to understand God's plan, to understand the world itself, one had to know what the authorities said on that, right? Now, this extended outside of theological works, and so, for understanding the structure of the universe, the authority in the Middle Ages, and really all the way up until about the 17th century, was the great Almagest of Ptolemy, a 1st century CE scholar living in the Roman Empire. And he had plotted out, this is how the universe is laid out. You have the earth at the center, and then all of these heavenly bodies revolve around the earth in circles. And because the observations didn't exactly cohere with that, he created these things called epicycles. And anyway, he had figured out, at least it was believed, the structure of the universe, and no one sought to challenge Ptolemy on that. He was simply accepted as the one who had written the master work on this. And so the works that were copied in the monastery were largely those that were considered authoritative. Now, monks did make copies of other things as well. The reason that so many works of classical antiquity survive, even things that you would wonder why monks would want to make copies of, right? Like Roman satire and, almost semi-pornographic Roman poetry at times and things like that, okay? I guess the monks lived maybe more exciting lives than we give them credit for, in some senses, right? They, because of the antiquity of these works, because they had good Latin styling, for whatever reason, they preserved things because they felt that there was authority to them. If a work didn't have any kind of authority, either because it was too recent or because its author was not held in respect or its author was simply unknown, who knows why they would reject things. But, if a work was not considered authoritative, it was not worth making copies of. Writing materials were tremendously expensive. And so the primary activity for those who had the skill to do so, which means that they knew how to write, and they knew how to write in specific, like they knew how to do what we would call calligraphy, okay? You couldn't just write in whatever handwriting that came natural to you, like we do in the modern age. You had to know how to form letters exactly as they should be formed in a kind of standardized way of doing this. monks and nuns who were, and there were women involved in this too. Monks and nuns who were trained at this, right, were given the task of making copies, whereas other monks, would maybe do some farming or take care of the food stores and things like that within the monastery. Okay, everybody had a job, right? The ones who were most skilled at writing would do the book copying. Now, as far as monks producing their own works, these were almost entirely, though there are exceptions. Monks did write some poetry, some of which actually gets racy at times, believe it or not. But for the most part, they're writing theological works. The most common type of work written by monks and nuns in the High Middle Ages was works of exegesis. This is biblical interpretation, right, where they would take verses from the Bible and explain what they meant, usually by referring to the standardized commentaries on these things. And so it's like, here we have a verse of the Bible, and this is a word from that verse. What does that word mean? Well, this is what Augustine said about that. And they might insert some of their own opinions about this, but they would always give deference to the authorities, right? So works of exegesis are ubiquitous in the monastery. Sermons, really, exegesis and sermons went along together. Sermons were often just extended exegesis that was meant to be spoken, as they, would have their periods of prayer. The abbot, especially during the Matin service at night, the abbot would give a sermon. Sermons were either written by the abbot, or sometimes monks would make notes of what the abbot had said and then try to produce it in long form later. There are even some interesting examples from monasteries where men and women were living in the same monastery, though they were kept strictly separate from each other, usually locked doors, and sometimes they even forgot where the keys were. There's a famous example from a monastery in Austria called Admont, where there was actually a fire that broke out in the women's cloister, and no one knew where the key was. It had been so long since they unlocked the door that, led into the women's area, that they couldn't find the key. Luckily, it seems none of the nuns were hurt, but they had a hard time kind of getting them out of there and getting them to safety. But in any case, in that same monastery, it seems that the nuns, there was a screen through which the abbot would preach to the nuns, and the nuns themselves made the notes and ended up writing down the sermons in long form. And I have published articles, for instance, looking at those sermons to try to discern the feminine voice in them, right? And so, and I'm not the only one who's done that kind of work. And so, literate nuns were often involved, and sometimes nuns probably wrote their own sermons. The abbess or other women of authority in the monastery would preach as well, and maybe write their own sermons. In addition, monks wrote histories, chronicles, and annals, and sometimes they were commissioned to do this, by secular authorities, but often these monastic histories take the home monastery, the monastery of the author, as the kind of locus for the turning of history. One of the works that's assigned for this week, the Monodier of Guibert of Nogent, which is a text that when I teach this in a normal classroom, I assign that work. It just didn't seem to make sense for the online class, but this is an intensely personal work. But Guibert was a monk, early 12th century monk. He later became the abbot of his monastery in Nogent in northern France, in Normandy. And this takes the shape of a history, but it's a very personal history, and a lot of it is just his, kind of recounting of things that happened at his monastery. Often histories, though, and he even goes back to kind of the origins of his monastery. Often these monastic histories, though not always, but often, they would set them in the grand sweep of human history. They would start with creation and talk about, some of the biblical events before coming to more recent events, and specifically events that touched on the monastery itself, right? So monks were definitely into writing history, and then the other genre of literature that monks and nuns tended to write was hagiography. That is, the lives of saints, often, maybe most often, saints that were associated with their specific monastery, right? So monasteries were often dedicated to saints. Maybe they even had a saint who had lived in their community or founded their community, and so they would write about the lives of those saints. So that's in a nutshell, that's what the intellectual environment of the monastery produced. And it produced it at a fairly high volume, not only the copying of ancient texts, but also the production of new texts, which were quite, for the most part, quite conservative in nature, meant to address the concerns of monks and nuns. These were not intended for circulation outside of the monastery, right? The sermons were intended for the community of monks or nuns who, was for which the author was a member. Same with the histories. They were, as I said, often focused on the home monastic community. And so these are not meant for wide circulation. They weren't looking for an audience outside the monastery for the most part. There are some monks and nuns who achieved a fame in this period that meant that they were consulted by people outside the monastery. They became famous, as it were, and maybe for different reasons. I have talked in this class about Bernard of Clairvaux. One of the texts that was assigned for this week is there's some excerpts from his sermons on the Song of Songs. Song of Songs is a book of the Bible that was in wide use in the monastery. It's an erotic love poem that was taken as an allegory for the relationship between Christ and the church. That was the most common interpretation. There were some other interpretations as well, but that's the most common one. And so Bernard gives these extended sermons on the Song of Songs, often only paying attention to one or two words and kind of going off of those words. In his lengthy, in fact, I'm in my office staring at on my bookshelf, 5 volumes of the Bernard of Clairvaux's sermon on the Song of Songs, and I think that even with all of that, he only, in the written versions of these, made it through like the middle of chapter 2 or something like that, okay? That was a text that circulated widely in the Middle Ages. Bernard of Clairvaux had such a fame, and was in such demand for his ideas, and for consultation even on political affairs and things like that, that his work reached outside of the monastery. Another example is the famous nun Hildegard of Bingen, who lived in the Rhineland region of Germany. She was especially notable for her mystic visions, but also for medical works. She, acted as a midwife, and she wrote works on things like gynecology, and sort of herbal remedies for things, and so she practiced medicine within the convent. And she had a fame that made her works in demand, and figures like Bernard and Hildegard and Peter the Venerable, the 12th century abbot of Cluny, they left behind dozens, if not hundreds, of letters. In fact, I'm also looking at on my bookshelf a translated volume of the letters of Bernard of Clairvaux, and I think there are about 600 of those that survive or something like that. Okay, and so the letters, were the things they wrote to people who were seeking their advice, or they were weighing in on the issues of the day. Right. Those, however, are exceptions. Most monks and nuns were not like Bernard or Hildegard or Peter the Venerable. Okay, they were not known outside the monastery. They really didn't think much about the needs or the concerns of people outside of their own monastic community, except for perhaps pastoral care that they did, for people who came to the monastery or something like that. So these are, within the community itself. And I do think that that's of interest, right? I do some what we call local history, and I think that's notable. Now, one of the things that Bachman pays a lot of attention to, and this is, for any discussion of the 12th century Renaissance, if we want to apply that term, needs to look at this, right? So the works of Plato, the Greek philosopher, were known to people in the Middle Ages, but not all of them. Many of his works were known, and, Plato, mostly as redacted through the Neoplatonists of like the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries, were known to figures like Augustine. Augustine was a Christian Neoplatonist, and so Plato was used But most of the works of Aristotle had passed out of existence in the West. People simply did not know them. There were only a small handful, and usually in fragmentary form, of the works of Aristotle that were even known to people in the early Middle Ages in Western Europe. But due to increased contact with the Muslim world, and due to the Crusades bringing Latin Christians into knowledge of what was contained in libraries in places like Constantinople, the works of Aristotle that were up to this point not known became known. Works like his texts on ethics and his physics and metaphysics. And so not just his works on logic and things like that were known. His weightier works, we might say, came into knowledge. Now, this was a challenge for Christian scholars in this period because Aristotle doesn't exactly play well with Christianity. Plato does. Plato's idea was that ultimate reality is found in the realm of ideas, in these things that he calls the forms, that come from this thing that he simply calls the one or the good. And it's easy to then take that and make that God, or put the good or the one and the forms in the mind of God. And this is exactly what figures like Augustine did, and even the Neoplatonists were kind of thinking along these theological lines. But Aristotle was an empiricist. He found reality by observation, by looking at things, examining specific examples, gathering data. He was, we might say, a scientist, though, and even had followed what we might call a rudimentary form of the scientific method, though that's, something that's fully developed only much later, like 17th century. So Aristotle, and Aristotle, moreover, he's tough to read. He's all about taxonomy and categorization and making sure that things are, put in. I mean, Aristotle would love spreadsheets, for instance, organizing things all in their nice, neat columns and rows and things like this, right? This doesn't exactly play well with Christian theology, which considers all God to be the source of everything. And so it became a challenge, but a challenge that high medieval intellectuals were very interested in undertaking, right? They got really excited about the ideas of Aristotle, and they wanted to fit this ancient scholar whose name was known and some of his works were known, and he was respected, and as more and more works of Aristotle came into knowledge in the West, they wanted to make this cohere with Christianity, right? This became the great intellectual enterprise of the 12th century, and really that interaction between the ideas of Aristotle and these Christian theologians is what spurred the main intellectual movement of this period, which we call scholasticism, and I'll have some things to say about that in due course. Okay. We should note, as a kind of side discussion here, that the Muslim world was largely responsible for the transmission of these Greek texts. Many of them translated from Greek into Arabic, or possibly Greek to Syriac to Arabic. The transmission and translation history of these things is really complex. But scholars as of the late 10th century were traveling to Muslim lands, especially to Muslim Spain, to places like Cordoba and Toledo, where there were Muslim schools, madrasas, and centers of learning where they were studying the works of Aristotle. And these scholars learned Arabic, translated these works from Arabic into Latin, brought them back to the West, and began to teach them in the schools. It's this through this means that Aristotle, and moreover some of the works of Plato that were unknown, like the Timaeus, which is Plato's arguably most metaphysical work, right? That is all the rage for a while in the 12th and 13th centuries as well, right? So these ancient Greek philosophers who were known and respected, now more of their stuff enters into the Christian world. Along with commentaries written by scholars outside the Christian world. The Muslim scholar Ibn Rushd, the Jewish scholar, though living in Egypt mostly, he did live in Spain for a while. He became the personal physician of the Sultan or the Caliph. I can't remember the title. I think it's the Mamluk Sultan in Egypt. But Maimonides, or Moses ben Maimon, the great Jewish Aristotelian. Okay, so their commentaries also came into knowledge of what these Western Latin scholars and began to be used by them. I will say it's around the same time that, and we've already discussed this a little bit, that the Corpus Juris Civilis, this great compendium of law organized or commissioned by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, that comes back into knowledge in the West. It shows up in Italy, and people start using this, right? So these ancient intellectual influences, and this, you can see why Haskins, says this is a renaissance, right? They're bringing back antiquity here. The main institutional environment where this stuff is happening is the cathedral school. And by this we mean in cathedrals. Now, a cathedral, of course, is the building where the diocesan government is housed, where the bishop has his chief residence in his church. Often, cathedrals had palaces where the bishops would live right next to them. But within the cathedral precinct, somewhere, possibly in the bishop's palace or possibly in a cloister connected to the cathedral or some building, right, for the training of clergy, for the most part, bishops were organizing schools. They were hiring masters to head these schools and to teach the students. And some of these schools came to have great reputations, where scholars came from far and wide. Many of them were intending to pursue careers in the clergy, but many of them, this is increasingly the case, many of them were intending simply to become educated and then parlay that into careers in things like government, in the secular sphere, right? So these cathedral school masters were the ones guiding them through this education. The education was, for the most part, the liberal arts tradition. They learned, the grammar, the rhetoric, the logic, and would move on to things like music and astronomy and geometry and arithmetic. But increasingly, they're moving on to the advanced study of theology and law and even medicine, right? So that some cathedral schools develop reputations for those. And what's really important here is the master is the one drawing people in. And scholars have worked a lot on these cathedral school masters and have tried to, understand the appeal, to understand the pedagogy that they pursued. The scholar whose work I think is most compelling in this regard is the American historian / literary scholar Stephen Jager. Jager's work looks really at the 11th century, and he kind of differentiates between the 11th century and the 12th century. Right? He says the 11th century is in many ways a continuation or the culmination of stuff that was put into place with the Carolingians, or maybe even going back to late antiquity, right? Where these masters were models for their students to follow. And so imitating the way the master talked, the master walked, the cadence of his voice, even like the depth or the timbre of his voice, the timbre of his voice, whatever that term is. This is these students at the cathedral schools were literally imitating the master. They were not looking for him to, give them some original nugget of knowledge. This is primarily about the transmission of the accepted authoritative corpus of work that, was part of the intellectual environment, right? That changes in the 12th century with figures like Abelard. And this is where we're going to come to a discussion of Abelard. I'm going to do a whole separate talk where we go through some of the texts that's assigned. But the Abelard is a master at the Cathedral School of Paris. He does talk about his own education and some of the experiences he had with the masters of schools he had attended. And for the most part, he doesn't think much of those masters because they're not doing what he thinks they should be doing, which is offering new and original interpretations of things, right? They are simply going with what has already been established, what has been accepted, and they're really not saying much at all, in his opinion. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop it there. We need to say more about the cathedral school environment and talk through some of the accomplishments of this before coming to a discussion of Abelard and Heloise. And there are some other aspects of the 12th century Renaissance that we need to deal with, at least briefly. But I think that's good for now. Thanks.